Good morning from Ecuador. This is Javier Cornejo. Let's talk about botanical studies in coastal Ecuador. Ecuador is a small country located right in the tropical belt in northwestern South America, south from Colombia, north and northwest from Peru, and bordered on the western side by the Pacific Ocean. During 19th century, among the most credited naturalists who visited the coast of Ecuador is Alexander von Humboldt, a German geographer, naturalist, and explorer, jointly with Aimé Bonpland, a French collector of plants. Both were working mostly on Andes of present Ecuador and Peru. Once in Peru, they went down to the port of Lima, took a ship, arriving in Guayaquil on January 1803, and spending 6 weeks gathering information from the southwestern part of the present Ecuador with the help of Juan Tafalla. All the collections gathered by Bonpland and Humboldt from America were sent to Paris Herbarium to be carefully studied by Carl Sigismund Kunz, one of the best taxonomists at that time. The results were published in Nova Genera et Species Plantarum, comprising approximately 4,500 species of plants. Many of the new species of plants that are common from coastal Ecuador were officially published for the first time. On 2020, a book that deals with the visit of Humboldt and Bonpland in detail to the area of Guayaquil has been published. From 1798 to 1804, Juan José Tafalla settled in Guayaquil. He collected around the city and towards Taura, Rio Bulubulu, Cordillera Chongoncolonche, Yaguachi, Jipijapa, and other places. The idea of Tafalla was to produce the first flora of the region. He collected over 500 species, describing in detail in Latin in situ, and also with his team painted over 300 plates of vascular plants. All of that material with detailed letters were sent to the Oficina Botanica to Hipólito Ruiz and José Pavón, who never published that material. Unfortunately for Tafalla, his collections and all his work remained lost in Madrid Herbarium for almost 200 years. It was until 1989 when Dr. Eduardo Estrella discovered all this lost material and made an exceptional editorial work publishing the Flora Guayaquilensis de Juan Tafalla. Juan Tafalla received the visit of Humboldt and Bonpland in January of 1803. Tafalla took Humboldt to collect to his favorite places, and Humboldt and Bonpland, as it is known, they published their work before Tafalla. That means that many of the new species that were discovered by Juan Tafalla were not credited to him. We know that after the publication of Flora Guayaquilensis, thanks to Dr. Eduardo Estrella for this masterpiece. And in the 19th century, the coast of Ecuador was visited by Henrik Franz Alexander Baron von Eggers. He was a Danish soldier and botanist. From 1891 to 1897, he made 1,700 collections of vascular plants, particularly from the coastal plain in El Recreo, his own hacienda, and Balao in the province of Guayas. El Recreo is a locality placed near Bahia de Caracas in the province of Manabí. In recent years have been observed that many of the species collected by Eggers in El Recreo that at that time were published as new species, and most of those are endemic to coastal Ecuador, are still present there. That means that the forests of El Recreo and surrounding areas as Cordillera del Bálsamo could be regarded as a living type genetic bank. During the 20th century, the taxonomic status of plants of Ecuador increased with the research and contribution by several prominent Swedish botanists. Flora of Ecuador is the pivotal publication about the plant taxonomy of Ecuador. Right after ending the Second World War, Gunnar Harlin, a botanist from GV&S Herbaria, came to Ecuador starting his collections for this project from the Clementina farm that is located in Los Rios province. La Clementina is the largest banana farm of America and perhaps the whole world that keeps the forest of Samama Hills because collect the water they need for the crops downstream. In subsequent years, Gunnar Harlin and Baron Ben Spart visited Ecuador, gathering thousands of collections of plants of the country, many of those from the coastal area producing hundreds of new species. To the present, flora of Ecuador is the best taxonomical treatment about the plants of the families of the country, the only one actually. However, the coast of Ecuador is still under-collected in most of its ecosystems. During the 20th century, the flora of coastal Ecuador was intensively studied at some localities by North American botanists Callaway Dodson and Alvin Gentry. Callaway Dodson was a taxonomist on orchids for over 50 years. Alvin Gentry studied in a tropical Bignoniaceae. Both combined efforts to produce the flora of Rio Palenque that was the first flora of the country in 1978. Flora of Jauneche, that is the biological station of the University of Guayaquil in 1985, and Flora of Capeira, a dry forest that sadly remains not published until present. Dodson and Gentry were studying the plant composition and habits in each of those localities in correlation to the levels of pluviosity, demonstrating that plant diversity and strategies increases with the amount of rains. It is most likely that they noticed that the life zones and ecosystems in several places were closely arranged with each other, being the coast of Ecuador an ideal place for botanical and floristic research. At the same time, they were doing field work, and in the 70s and starting the 80s, they were alarmed about the destruction of forests. Massive areas of native vegetation were converted to cattle farming. They published that in Biological Extinction in Western Ecuador in the Annals of the Missouri Botanical Garden in 1991. That is the first publication in English language that called attention worldwide what was sadly happening on the coast of Ecuador. Despite the alarm given by Dodson and Gentry in biological extinction in western Ecuador, to the present, the efforts for conservation are still insufficient. In recent times, surprising rediscoveries of local and regional flora have been done. That is the case of Gasteranthus extinctus, the species on the left side of your screen with beautiful bright orange cleistogamic corollas. That is a low herb of wet forest rediscovered from Centinela the last year. By initiative of colleagues from the Field Museum, in companion with a team of almost 10 people from several institutions in which I was honored to be part of that expedition, the species was found in several populations in the same area previously reported by Dodson and Gentry. Another case even more surprising is that of Nasa humboldtiana, originally gathered by Richard Spruce in 1861 in Tungurahua, and only known by the type, until a recent rediscovery on the western side of the province of Chimborazo. These two examples perhaps means that we still have time for saving species of plant, endangered species of plant in western Ecuador. At present, most of dry forests in continental Ecuador are in secondary condition. One of the best conserved dry forests can be found in Puna Island. The main reasons that can explain its conservation are the isolation and the almost total absence of roads. The flora of Puna Island have been carefully studied by Jens Madsen and collaborators, based on a splendid collections of plants gathered by the first author. Flora Puna not only deals about vascular plants, but also provides historical information about plant uses since the colonial period. We have to keep in mind that when Spanish conqueror Francisco Pizarro arrived first time to the Gulf of Guayaquil, he was very impressed as a witness of the Puna pre-Hispanic Navy. Those guys were using balsa raft built from local trees and lianas. They were going to the war against Tumbas. Another aspect that must be highlighted is that what had been found on the phytochemical compounds of plants from coastal Ecuador. In recent years, with the collaboration of Dra. María Eugenia Rondón from Universidad de los Andes, around 50 species of plants have been screened. Most of those abundant alkaloids correlated to the type of soils have been found. It is most likely that the species from the dry forest could be like a mine of alkaloids and another compound like oils that are very attractive for medicine, industry, and other purposes. There are two main extra-Andean cordilleras on the coast of Ecuador. Chongoncolonche, that is located from southern Manabí along Santa Elena province and reaching Guayas province, and Machu Picchu Mountains located at the northwestern part of the country in the provinces of Esmeraldas reaching to northern Manabí. A pioneer work of the flora of Chongoncolonche was the publication by Flor de María Valverde, at that time professor of Faculty of Natural Sciences at the University of Guayaquil, in 1991. The title of that work is Present Condition of Natural Vegetation of Cordillera Chongoncolonche. That publication was achieved thanks to the partial collaboration of Callaway Dodson and Alvin Gentry, and deals mostly with the dry forest flora up to 350 meters above sea level. On August 3rd, 1993, was an airplane crash on the top of Chongoncolonche Mountains in which Alvin Gentry passed away. One of the survivors, the director of Wild Herbarium, Carmen Boniface, decided to start the study of the flora of the mostly floristically unknown upper part of Chongoncolonche Mountains, that is from 400 meters above sea level up to 1,000 meters. Subsequent publications about the flora of Chongoncolonche takes mostly identifications provided in these two mentioned works. In 2006 was published the floristic checklist of Machu Picchu Mountains of northwestern Ecuador, thanks to the efforts of John Clark, an excellent and prolific collector of plants, with David Neal and Mercedes Asanza from the QCNE Herbarium. That is the first publication of the Cordillera, of the flora of the Cordillera in northwestern Ecuador. A good example to demonstrate the floristic affinities between Old and New World could be the genus Meliosma in the family Zabiaceae. Meliosma exhibit an amphipacific pattern of distribution. Abundant fossil records of endocarps and leaves of Meliosma have been found in Europe, Asia, and northwestern North America, suggesting that ancestral species crossed from northern Asia to North America through the Bering Land Bridge. An old record of Meliosma have been found from the Upper Eocene in South China, named recently as Meliosma eozenica. At that time, during the Eocene, southern Central America and coastal Ecuador was under the Pacific Ocean. Once the Andes uplift, Meliosma colonized it and produced a massive process of speciation. The absence of fossil records of Meliosma from the Neotropics confirms a recent presence for that genus. The genus comprises around 80 species in the Neotropics, mostly of Andean distribution. The few endemics on coastal Ecuador, as Meliosma gracilis on the left side, most likely is a derived species from Andean ancestral origin. Another good example to demonstrate the affinities of neotropical and old world floras is the family Lecetidaceae. The Lecetidaceae, known also as the Brazil nut family, is composed of 10 genera and 232 species in the neotropics. From those 232 species, 46 occur in Ecuador. During recent years, 10 new species have been described in this family jointly with Scott Morai. At least 9 of those are restricted to northwestern Ecuador. The flowers and fruits of Lecetidaceae are predated by agoutis and pacas. Actually, the flower is predated once it's fallen on the ground, but these vertebrates feed on the areoles of the seeds and helps in the dispersal of the species. There are several genera with symmetric flowers as Gustavia. You can see Gustavia at the upper left corner, and also Grias. And there are other group of genera with zygomorphic flowers as Schweilera, Lecitis, Corupita, etc. In Schweilera, for example, you can see Schweilera integrifolia at the upper row with a longitudinal section of the androphore in which you can see the coils or chambers. That adaptation is for bee pollination. Yeah? And those androphores are very important for taxonomic studies. This feature was discovered by Scott Morai during the past 15 years, I think. As the taxonomy was often confusing and hard to tell from herbarium material, was needed to go to the field almost to check each tree of each collection. In herbarium, you can see lots of collections of Lecetidaceae, but what happened is that the androphore get smashed during the herborization process. So it is needed to go again to the same place, the same locality, even to find the same tree and collect the flowers, to do the sections in the field, preserve the flowers in alcohol for further studies, and take photos in situ in order so we can study the coils. And for example, in this Schweilera integrifolia was very important to discover that it has a triple coil. Schweilera integrifolia was firstly collected by Juan Tafala nearby the Bulu Bulu River that is at present the Reserva Ecológica Manglares Chubute, where the high population of Schweilera integrifolia was found still extant there. That was a very good field discovery because helped a lot to Scott to establish the generic characters to recognize that clade. A similar example is also the Caperaceae family, the caper family. Caperaceae broadly distributed also in the New World as well as in the Old World. In the molecular tree on the right side, you can see the neotropical taxa in light blue and blue color. Blue color mostly for North American taxa. Yeah, but you see that all of those American or New World taxa are correlated and genetically derived from the Old World taxa. For example, the green ones are those from Africa, and the orange ones from Asia. So the oldest relatives of Neotropical Capricia are those from the Old World. That is a fact. An interesting taxonomic discovery that deserves to be mentioned is that of Mangleticornia ecuadorensis. Mangleticornia ecuadorensis, a new genus and a new species, restricted to mangroves and adjacent salt marshes in the Gulf of Guayaquil, and even present in the city of Guayaquil, well, as an infrequent floristic element. The leaves are not as the usual plant. Mangleticornia has no those kind of leaves with developed blades, and the corollas, the flowers are so tiny and with no corollas and with no visible calyxes. The stigma is only 1 millimeter long when present, and the anthers up to 1 millimeter long, and flowers are not often observed. The species has been very few times collected and is mostly an overlooked species in mangroves. Here we have a selection of new species of trees with enormous leaves, all of those found on the Chocón area during the past 20 years, from coastal plain to the western side of Andes, mostly of families Lecetidaceae, Rubiaceae, mainly genus Pentagonia, and also even in the Lauraceae, and that Aniba ecuadorica was recently published the last month. It is interesting to see that in the Chocón area, as the pluviosity is higher, the species of plants tend to produce larger leaves and also larger fruits. It is still unknown if the larger fruits that are present on western Ecuador is the result of co-adaptation with extinct megafauna. That would be a very interesting case of study. Here we have a good selection of new species described during the past 20 years also, but these are restricted to the equatorial Pacific dry forest. Several of those are species of seasonal behavior. It is interesting to note that, and most of those were not previously collected or found because you cannot find it during the dry season. They are only visible during the rainy season. Uh, Most of those reproduced by bulbs that are under the ground. The vegetative part dies, decays and die, and actually disappear during the dry season. You cannot observe the species. People could easily think that there's no any species of interest in some area, for example, as is the case of several of those recently discovered. But when the rainy season is coming, the early rains helps to sprout for those bulbs, and the species are there. You can see them. And that way we have found several new species, for example, in the genus Sanctosoma, as Sanctosoma guayaquilense, Sanctosoma gracie, and several other, for example, in Amaryllidaceae family also with the same behavior. Yeah, we even have found orchids. You could say orchids in a dry forest. Okay, there are some part of dry forest that are under the horizontal precipitation, mainly from in the Manabi, in the area of Manabi province. And there you can find endemics as Anthurium gallardum and also Epidendrum aromoense, both found in the same locality in the Aromo. Yeah. Other species of interest are Dioscorea magnibracteata that produce tubers that storage starches that could be edible. And Pseudium guayaquilense that has been recently screened to know the chemical composition and has very interesting composition or concentration of oils. Yeah. The oceanic currents not only affect the terra firma ecosystems, but also produce a strong influence on the floristic compositions in mangroves. Therefore, two floristic subunits have been found after carefully studying the pattern of distribution of this species throughout the mangroves on the coast of Ecuador. Two floristic subunits known as the Chocoan mangroves and the Equatorial Pacific mangroves, each of those correspond under the influence to each oceanic current. And in the Pleistocene existed well-developed mangrove and terra firma ecosystems on coastal Ecuador, with closed canopy that allowed umbratic understory in cooler environments in comparison to today. Las Vegas people is the earliest human group that appeared at that time at the peninsula de Santa Elena. Fossil fruits of Bonellius brucei, a primulaceae tree that is endemic to the region of dry forests of coastal Ecuador and northwestern Peru, have been found in burials of Las Vegas people. It is of interest to understand that the barbasco fruits are used for washing hair against dandruff, for cleaning clothes, also as a potent ichthyotoxic used for fishing, and also for disinfecting wounds in cattle. The several uses preserved to the present by tradition of people from coastal Ecuador and connected to the evidence of fossil fruits found in the burials of Las Vegas people is the evidence that they knew about the uses of plants. That is before even the Egyptian Empire period. It is also of interest to talk about the applications of native species in the region. I would like to talk about a floating island project that was developed by the Ministerio del Ambiente and a local environmental company that is PSI. Concerned about a big problem that has the city of Guayaquil, that is the shed of human and even industrial waste into the mangroves and the Gulf of Guayaquil. A number of islands, artificial islands, were settled in the Palanqueado Creek. The matrix were elaborated from recycled material, and the purpose was that the species of plants were absorbing the excess of nitrogen, extracting the nitrogen from the polluted waters, and also contribute to capture heavy metals as lead and cadmium. The plants of Rhizophyra grew up as fast as 1 meter per year, or sometimes even a bit more, being of faster growing than the natural populations in mangroves. After a couple of years in the area were observed larger sizes of crabs, aquatic crabs of genus Calinectes, as that at the upper left corner. And also larger sizes of fish were observed among the island. Yeah, it called attention, and people were there for fishing even. That means kind of recovering not only the quality of water, but also the uses of the area. An oxygenation system was also implemented there, and the results were really amazing. Conclusions. It is needed to develop more effective programs of conservation and restoration of ecosystems, including the rescue of endangered species of plants. We need to accelerate the process of botanical collections and studies before ecosystems get seriously affected or even destroyed. Further, phytochemical studies are urgently needed. Thank you very much for your attention. Feng Shan Kanxiani. Muchas gracias a todos.